When most nowadays think of NASCAR's connection to the city of Chicago, you probably either think of the upcoming Chicago Street Race this July or the Chicagoland Speedway that NASCAR frequented for almost 20 years. Maybe you think of Chicago Motor Speedway or the stories of Soldier Field races. Hell, maybe you even think of Mike Joy, an all-time great NASCAR commentator who was born in Chicago. But there's a forgotten story from the Windy City involving both NASCAR and organized Chicago crime. The origins came from one man, Bob Pronger. Pronger was born on January 22, 1922 in Blue Island, Illinois, a suburb city of Chicago located near Tinley Park. He would grow up oblivious of racing as a child, instead choosing basketball due to being 6'6", the same height, actually a little taller, than future Daytona 500 champion Michael Waltrip. But in 1948, the 26-year-old had a paradigm shift in life. Late in 1948, he saw his first stock car race at Chicago's Raceway Park and was hooked immediately. And not only that, not as a racing fan, he wanted to compete. By 1949, he's making his first starts in a 1940 Mercury, and against all odds, he showed out in 49, winning multiple times in the championship stock car club. One of these wins coming in an all-out rainstorm. And in 1950, he stormed out of the gate at Raceway Park, winning 5 races in the first 6 weeks of competition before falling back to 5th in the final point standings. So in 1951, he'd followed up with a dominant run of 19 feature wins. Suffice to say, he was in his playground. So that same year, he'd take his talents and dip his toes into new racing organizations for the first time. And one of these was the newly formed NASCAR. And not just any NASCAR race. It would be the second ever Southern 500 at Darlington Raceway. Today, Darlington is a mile and a third track, making the Southern 500 a grueling 367 laps. But in 1951, the track had a slightly different layout, a 1.25 mile layout, making the race 400 laps. So, on Labor Day of 1951, an 82-car field would attempt what would turn into a 6.5-hour grinding duel. Pronger outlasting 35 other drivers to come home 47th in his number 49 Oldsmobile, 68 laps away from finishing, 415 miles on the day, and roughly 5 hours of racing on a day that was nearly 95 degrees Fahrenheit. For the time, it was actually impressive as he outlasted greats like Curtis Turner and Buck Baker, as well as defending Grand National Champion Bill Rexford. For his troubles, Pronger made $50, or just about $600 in terms of 2023 inflation. While he raced most of his successful career around Chicago and Northern Illinois, he did have other major claims to fame, one of which was in NASCAR, as it was at none other than the famed Daytona Beach course. In 1953, his Oldsmobile won the pole at Daytona in a record-shattering pace. The prior record to this was set by Joe Littlejohn. In 1950, he had a lap of 100.28 miles per hour. Pronger's lap would be an average of 115.77 miles an hour. But this didn't come without controversy either, as when NASCAR officials went to examine his engine, he refused to give them and any other tools access. For this, he was fined $50, and the time was disallowed. Rumors were that Pronger had stolen the car right off the Oldsmobile assembly line, and this is how much of his brief time in NASCAR could be described: rumor-filled. Another rumor that came out of that same pole-setting penalty was that he actually socked a NASCAR official in the face. But, much like the majority of stories from this time, we're never going to know for sure if it was actually true. But even with all of this, NASCAR did allow Pronger to start on the pole next to second-place starter Fonnie Flock. The two went back and forth as they were pretty good friends through the time they'd been around each other racing, and they made a bet that one could beat the other to lead lap 1. So, heading to the north end of the track, Flock grabbed a 5-car length lead at the start over Pronger. While Flock eased his car into the corner, being a veteran of the track and knowing how to drive it, Pronger was new and sailed off into the corner. His black and red Oldsmobile would flip twice before landing on its wheels in front of the pack. Luckily, he wasn't hit, and after checking over his car, making sure it would work and seeing all four wheels were still on it, he jumped back into that sucker and ran 51st of 57 cars. Much like his NASCAR Cup career, outside of those two moments, well, they weren't really all that noteworthy. In 1954, he was found with an illegal car, and NASCAR didn't allow him to race. Between 51 and 61, he only made 9 Grand National starts, though one of them was pretty big as he was in the inaugural Daytona 500, finishing 35th. For much of his career, he'd continued to frequent the Midwest racing scene. But with this, he'd been living a double life of crime. Back home in Chicago, his life still revolved around cars. In this case, though, they were stolen cars. Pronger would run what was known as a chop shop, a business that acted much like a car body shop, except instead of legally working on normal people's cars, they would disassemble and sell the pieces and parts of stolen cars. So much of his racing career in the late 50s through his track championships that were into the 60s were funded by illegal activities. Not something out of the ordinary for really any race car drivers at the time who had any brief success at that. This flowed on for decades, as his chop shop began what was part of a car theft ring. And he'd cover both Chicago and northwestern Indiana, selling parts of cars to warehouses that would sell them as well, and he'd make a pretty penny off of it. And when I say a pretty penny, I mean he made straight up bank on this thing. With help from the Chicago mob, he was making over $125,000 a year in the 60s and 70s. And it was part of a multi-million-dollar a year scheme. In a lot of ways, he was like the chop shop version of Heisenberg, keeping his criminal life a complete secret from his wife, family, and friends. By all accounts, he was a normal working-class man to the rest of the world. But as the 60s rolled into the 70s, things kept escalating. With local racing, he dominated, escalating his winnings to basically outspend the field while also being the best driver out there. This elevated nature kept up with his work with the Chicago mob. As he kept working with higher and higher profile mobsters, his status also began to become higher and higher. People started to wonder how a local auto shop worker could buy so much racing equipment, or how he could afford to drive anywhere he wanted at a moment's notice out of state, or how he could afford a damn Cessna plane. It got to the point where local police also started to notice and investigate into his business and behavior more. The mob didn't like this as it added attention to their activity, so they tried to swiftly deal with it, attempting to end his life not once, not twice, but 3 times in the first half of 1971. The first being at his apartment, the second 2 actually being at a racetrack where they attempted to shoot him. The failed attempts only added more attention to Pronger and the mob, as Bob now was trying to get the police involved to protect him. Then, on June 17, 1971, a Thursday, Pronger was last seen alive driving a black Cadillac. By the next Tuesday, he'd be reported missing by his father, and only 5 days later, what was thought to be his body would be found in some wooded areas under a mattress near the town of Griffith, Indiana, near the larger Gary, Indiana. Initial investigations had been inconclusive with evidence that the body could have been his after some dental and fingerprint records were brought up for use. But in an odd turn of events, before further investigation could be done, the body was ordered by the state to be cremated, meaning that nobody could ever 100% know, but they had to assume it was his body. And this is something that was the MO of the mob at the time. The Chicago Mafia had a lot of fingers in a lot of places of power, whether it be police, government, workers around cities, doesn't matter what it was, they had the influence. And this is what's theorized to have happened here. They knew what they'd done, they knew it was him, and they knew they had to get rid of the evidence, so they burned it away really quickly. The legacy of Pronger was a follow-up of death and failure. The car theft ring had dried up on the Vine from where he was running it, and the Chicago mob had all of its ties cut with his timely disappearance. His younger brother, John, would be gunned down also in front of his home in 1988 as John tried to follow in his footsteps, getting involved with the Chicago Mafia and then running chop shops in the area as well and doing virtually the same activities as well as other illegal and illicit activities. The raceway park that Bob had dominated lasted to the new millennium, being bulldozed in 2000 after 62 years of use. But with all of that, I'm going to pass it all on to you. What are your favorite stories of NASCAR criminals? Let me know down in the comments below. While you're at it, leave a like in this video, share this video, and subscribe to the channel for more great NASCAR content. Thank you so much to all my channel members for your continued support, and be sure to watch the NASCAR Weekly Podcast tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on my channel. Thank you so much, and I can't wait to see you there. So until then, have a good one.